Hey, happy Friday. I'm not gonna lie to you, I did not plan to do a feature Friday today because it has been hot in Chicago this week. It has been draining my energy. I've just been coming home and kind of just like laying and staring at the ceiling and trying to read. Additionally, as you saw, today we are going to be talking about Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, which is an immensely buzzy book. And there is this combination from my end and my thinking of it has already been talked about quite a lot, and do we really need another white woman adding to the conversation? But with that full kind of like meta awareness, I do want to sit and talk about it more as a kind of casual chat. Additionally, because I'm not going to be able to touch on all of the nuance here, but as someone who has been reading R.F. Kuang since the Poppy War came out, even if I was a little slow on picking up the sequels at times, I really am interested in the deviations in this book, the conversations in this book, and how well it is doing. I saw R.F. Kuang post, I believe on Instagram, that this book has been on the bestseller list the longest for her, which on one hand makes sense because it is a more accessible title than something like The Poppy War and Babel, which are a little heftier in terms of crossover appeal, because this is basically a literary thriller. However, it's also very compelling and interesting to me because the internet conversations around this book make sense to me, which we will get into, I'm sure, but I'm very interested in how audiences that maybe aren't as plugged in online and to online conversations respond here, because as you probably know if you've tuned in here, this book follows a protagonist, June, who is an author who has not been incredibly successful. She has had one book, a debut published by an indie, like smaller press, and it wasn't received in the way that she hoped and thought it would be. Meanwhile, she has a college acquaintance friend, Athena, who is incredibly successful on the literary scene, and the book starts out with them getting drinks, and Athena is talking basically about her movie deal to June. And June is pretty bitter and resentful in her narrative because we are seeing this book, this story, through the first person. So we are going on this adventure with someone that we as readers are not supposed to necessarily be rooting for. And it's this extra layer of complication of putting us in her head. It's kind of anti-hero narrative. It is the summer of anti-heroes, apparently. And I found this particularly interesting because to my reading and recollection of both the Poppy War trilogy and Babel, this is the first time that we are getting first person from Kuang, and her voice in this is so different than her voice in these other works. And I haven't been completely clued in to all of the conversations regarding this book because I wanted to go in with as fresh of eyes as I possibly could. And because I love Kuang's other work, this was basically an auto buy for me. Although I didn't buy it, I got it from the library because I'm trying to be better about those things. And so the voice is so distinctly different here because we are getting this from June's point of view. And I've heard a little bit of conversation around this in particular. One, a criticism of the writing style of it being simplistic and the writing not necessarily being as good. And then also the fact and the contextualization of that being because we are in June's head. And especially when you put this up against Kuang's other work, it is a stark difference in the kind of language and the writing, which I find endlessly fascinating because we know it is for a purpose, but then in comparison, it really illuminates what that purpose is. And so, okay, these two are out to drinks. They go back to Athena's apartment, and Athena tragically and pretty satirically passes away. I don't want to ruin that moment if you haven't read this book, but know that it is a little over the top while also, I guess, being conceivable. But this is the moment where the absurd kind of pops in, and it gives us a hint of how kind of unhinged this may end up being. And the narrative really does kind of walk this razor's edge of like completely plausible because it is roasting the literary industry and ecosystem, and I want to say a lot of ways, but like that's the whole point. But it also kind of walks this edge of satirical and putting things a little over the top in order to make a point, which honestly could also be read as a satire of thrillers themselves. I don't know. So June is in the apartment when Athena passes away. She is the one that sees this, and this puts her and gives her access to this story in some ways and puts her in closer proximity and allows her to kind of frame herself as a better friend of Athena than she was, while also acknowledging the kind of dissonance of that and her moving through those emotions of this acquaintance that she spent most of her internal life really jealous of and really bitter about, then being so tightly tied to her story, or her story being so closely aligned with Athena's. But while she is at this apartment, Athena shows her her current working manuscript. And in the chaos and the hullabaloo, June still has this manuscript that she, in her kind of processing of these emotions, reads and realizes is really great. And so she decides to take this manuscript for herself and polish it up and submit it. And she rationalizes this to herself because we hear her doing it. We hear her rationalizing things throughout this book. And it really, I think the first person of this cannot be overstated, because it is putting us into the thought process of someone who has these tendencies. And it's also this idea of the centering of white women and how white women center themselves in these stories and as the victim. And so, I mean, that's part of the reason that I was like, do I really need to add my 2 cents here? And the answer is absolutely I do not, but I do want to kind of talk about it because I find it so fascinating and so engaging. So in this justification, she has kind of reworked a lot of this book. And so she's basically telling herself, well, I had as much of a hand in it as Athena did, and rationalizing what she's added. Though as we go throughout the narrative, we realize the bits she's added are the most problematic, simplistic bits, and so that's complicated as well. And so then we're following June on the kind of trajectory of this book, and as parts of the literary community, even, you know, just as consumers, we can kind of recognize where this story is going to go in terms of the discourse and the arc of it. And things like American Dirt were called out directly in kind of throwaway lines of the text. And that, of course, is the instance that I most directly was able to link this kind of arc to. It obviously deviates in a lot of places, but the changing of the name, the taking on of this kind of ambiguous identity, the way that the narrative was framed, and that gets at a little bit too my thinking of, oh, I'm really interested in how people outside of these conversations more traditionally are responding to this, because I still get on Facebook sometimes and see people recommend American Dirt, and people that think of themselves as great allies or very liberal, whatever that may mean to you. They're totally divorced of a lot of the criticisms of the book. And there was a time where I kind of have to kind of gauge my relationship with the poster, to be completely honest, where I have popped in and been like, hey, just so you know. And that's a really delicate thing too, because I recognize in that moment how online I am, but also how important I think that conversation is. And so one thing I really appreciate about this book is how nuanced everything is. I mean, there are things that are pretty cut and dry in terms of especially like racism, but it's looking at all of the gradients of it to the point where there is a line, and I didn't mark it, I'm so sorry, that basically feels like a subtweet. It's obviously not a tweet. And the role of Twitter in this is very interesting, especially looking at the kind of ecosystem of Twitter currently and how it's on a decline, because this book feels very of the current moment. And I'm very interested in how it continues to resonate or continues to read as the social landscape kind of changes. But there was a line that really read as a kind of response to a lot of the criticisms that were being levied against Letty in particular in Babel, which, as you know, if you've watched my video on Babel, I thought that that character was handled really well. I thought that whole exploration was handled really well. Now, to be clear, my thoughts on the matter don't matter in the grand scheme of things, but there was a lot of conversation about how that was handled and a lot of white fragility in the response to Letty in particular. And a lot of that was explored through June's narrative eyes as well. We would see her say these really kind of messed up things and then kind of rationalize them to herself, basically telling herself, well, I'm a good person though because of this, or even where she was unable to recognize her instincts and her bad moves, especially in terms of like the idea of white women victimhood, in particularly a scenario where she has been asked if she wants a sensitivity reader for this book because it involves very specific Chinese history, and she says, no, I think I've got it, and actually gets in a tussle with one of the editorial assistants. Tussle is a strong word, but one of the editorial assistants on the project had really pushed back and recommended the sensitivity read, and June really balked at that. We as a reader, or I as a reader, perceives that as her worrying about there being things found, which obviously there were later by readers, and this is where it kind of calls out and in the book kind of community on Twitter and YouTube and TikTok and wherever. That was a very interesting moment because I have always been a reader first and foremost, but I had to kind of look at myself and realize I am now involved in forwarding these conversations online, and that was kind of a very surreal moment for me, but it was important for me to look in the mirror in those moments throughout the book, right? So I think that the humor and the almost satirical nature of the writing here and all of this kind of helped keep things moving, especially as the plot is so contingent on this kind of publishing arc and circle. And so it could feel, I would think, to an outsider, potentially inactive because we are so in June's head and so kind of reliant on the beats that as a reader and a member of discourse online, we can almost anticipate. But again, I'm not sure how that will read to outside audiences. I don't think that it will read badly, to be clear, necessarily. I'm just very interested in how this perception and this awareness kind of filters everything. Anyway, tangent. So there is obviously the call out of June through the entire narrative and the kind of like subtle intricacies of all of it, but also then the kind of calling out of the entire book ecosystem and how we all have culpability in different scenarios in all instances, and how the system is kind of the system it is and what that means. From like the more inaccessible to everyday readers author group chats to, you know, the online conversations, online discourse, and this idea that especially in publishing, so much is so selfish at the heart of things, and not always that that is bad, but especially looking at June's history, she has debuted this book again that didn't do super well, and she feels slighted in some way. And I think that we see this so often, and I really want to be careful about how I talk about this because again, I really respect authors, but I think it's also undeniable that we do see some people popping up that have not had the success that they want or that they feel they deserve, and from that a bitterness kind of seeps in. And this is where you will also see people, as we saw in this narrative, really saying that diversity has stolen something from them. But we know that that is not the case because again, we are still seeing predominantly white lists, and this book, again, in how quick it is, it's such a quick short read, but it explores all of this on some level. The idea of where a marketing budget goes, the ideas of the conversations that happen, the idea of kind of tokenism. It explores how even Athena was really pigeonholed into writing about her identity. And so this idea of who gets to tell what stories, and that really is central to everything because again, Kuang isn't presenting a simple or simplified or simplistic narrative here. She really is complicating and digging into all of this. No stone really is left unturned because it is even exploring the kind of idea of who gets to tell what stories, obviously with June at the center of it and that whole exploration and discourse. But then we also have this exploration with Athena as well. And June starts, and it's part of her rationalization as well. So we have to take everything in this book with a grain of salt if we are getting it from her perspective, which we're getting everything from her perspective, which really works things and also kind of shows us who we are trained to be sympathetic to, all of this. There's so much exploration of bias, who gets to come back, who gets redemption arcs, all of it, right? There's too much to talk about, really. And so in June's justification to herself, she mentally goes through what she thinks Athena has stolen from her narratively in terms of very personal experiences, and also recalls, which is mirrored by another character to her later, how Athena has this habit of pulling from other people's lives or things that they view as their emotions that she is then reflecting in her work. And I think this is a larger narrative kind of exploration of the nature of storytelling, and it's connected to that whose stories get to be told by who, and also digging at that idea of write what you know. But then also, what does it mean to know? And I think that this book is an excellent conversation starter in that way. And so there's the more cut and dry aspects here that we think we know, especially from internet discourse, but then it's also looking to illuminate, to my reading, all of the shades of gray. And again, it's not presenting us with answers or easy kind of platitudes or takeaways. It's really making us sit in this descent. And then also this idea of how far someone goes once there is no turning back. And it's really interesting to me because I think this is the closest narratively we have ever been to one of Kuang's characters. And I am so interested in the kind of versatility to her writing that this is demonstrating. And again, I think that this is a very of the moment piece, but it also reflects a real dexterity narratively. And there are still these moments that peek through of almost relatability with June, because we are supposed to say, oh, we are all, or at least I interpret it this way, as we are all capable of this if we don't watch ourselves. That in particularly being like when she gets her first big windfall of money, what does she do? She goes to the dentist and she goes to IKEA. These very normal things and this idea of what our aspirations are, but then it's also balancing this idea of what the aspirations are, because at a certain point, June is taken care of financially, and yet she continues to seek this acclaim, this notoriety. She wants to be someone. She wants to be remembered. She's constantly balking with her family at this idea of settling down and getting a normal job, and there is this almost indignation from her perspective about it, and being in her head, seeing her bitterness against those who have succeeded above her, to her view. One, again, kind of circling back to an idea I don't think I finished, that her debut and this writing, especially as we are kind of exploring it through her voice, through this first person narrative, maybe isn't the best. There is a moment where she talks about someone on her team in her debut not remembering whether she published a novel or a memoir, and it's kind of presented as this, I'm not getting enough attention from my publisher and they don't even know what my book is, which is an option. Like, that is a possibility. However, an alternate possibility there is that June's work is so autobiographical, she is so incapable of writing something outside of herself that it reads as a memoir, and there's so much blurring of the lines that it's indistinguishable, and so it doesn't stand out on its own, which, based on the trajectory and her writing trajectory in this book and her inability to really hook into something, I personally feel is the more likely option. And there is this exploration that I really appreciated too, going back to this kind of resentment and this exploration of success as an artistic creative specifically. I think that there is always, in any kind of artistic endeavor or program, this possibility for resentment and jealousy to build up, especially when viewing your work and thinking about what you want and what you think you deserve and your own abilities, and also this inability to see how your writing reads on the outside in some ways. I have read submissions for things before, whether it be as an intern for a literary agent, and as I've said before, I was not like a final hand in anything. I was just giving feedback, second opinions on things, and also in theaters as a literary intern and apprentice, or, you know, being a literary manager or literary manager adjacent. I've never been a literary manager for a company, to be clear, but I have read a lot of scripts for development and given feedback on them. And I saw this more with LORT theater companies, people who were submitting blind to LORT theater companies. And you would see it every once in a while. And I have one play that I remember very specifically. Don't remember the name of the playwright, don't remember the name of the play, but I remember how antagonistic the cover letter essentially with the submission was. Basically, I dare you to produce this. No one's ever given me the time of day. I am a genius. Basically, I'm obviously hyperbolizing here. But there was so much anger and resentment in that cover letter from someone who didn't think that they had been given the proper chance at this. They hadn't been given a production, and why not? And then going in to read the submission, trying not to let that impact your reading of the submission is very difficult because it was a very angry letter. And then reading the submission and realizing exactly why. And in this case, it wasn't just that the writing was subpar, but that there was really racist explorations in the play. I'm not laughing at that, but just how closely it aligns with this. And so it's again going back to this idea of comparing what you think you deserve. And something that really stuck out to me in this narrative, kind of thinking back on it, is that June is really incapable of recognizing her own privilege in a lot of ways. Like, sure, she hasn't been given the career or had the career that she thinks she deserves until a certain point in this book, and we see what happens with that. But she also met Athena at Yale, and she's never really grappled with the privileges she's been given in certain situations. Now, in some ways, that's a much deeper conversation as well, but there is this idea that June does not see herself clearly, which we know from the narrative. And so it's so twisty and everything. There are these moments where we know June is clearly in the wrong, which is a lot of the book. But then there are also moments where we can recognize where the book community, in whatever capacity, whether it be publishing, whether it be readership, reviewer community, has, improper takes on something that even when well-intentioned, when we can see behind the scenes of what's going on with June, we know she's in the wrong, but it also explores the kind of nature of the pile-on. And one of the really interesting things too in this narrative, as I've kind of talked about in different ways throughout here, is having to be totally aware of being in June's head. So having to kind of try and divorce yourself and see objectively in a way to really look at everything that's being criticized, because we are opening up a lot of conversations here, and there are a lot of things that do need to be criticized, but then we have to recognize that we are seeing everything through a filter. So it's, where are these conversations happening? What are the conversations? And there are so many of them. And so a lot of that is why I can't sit here and tell you definitively about anything. I have no real insight. I'm just kind of marveling at the construction, at the conversations, at the ideas here. And while I do think this feels so of the moment, I think it's a moment we need to have. And I think the fact that we need to have it has been reflected in the sales numbers and the success of this book. And the success of this book has been visual and anecdotal for me this week, in that I got on the train to go to work earlier this week. I sit down and kitty corner to me is another woman reading Yellowface. And so I think that these are conversations we're obviously interested in having. I'm not pretending in any way that my voice is needed in this conversation. I'm not pretending in any way that I am particularly insightful about this conversation. I'm just nerding out about a book and an author that I find really compelling and interesting. I'm very, very interested to see the rest of Kuang's career, and the fact that we are so early in that career is particularly exciting to me, because I think that this book is really a start of reflecting a real versatility. Not that there wasn't a versatility demonstrated between the Poppy War trilogy and Babel, to be clear. Not that I wouldn't have been happy to spend the rest of my reading life with her in one of those realms, to be clear, but I think that this just offers us so many more narrative possibilities as readers, and I'm really excited to see what worlds she takes us to. I also live in fear of her a little bit, because she has been publishing very quickly, and I believe, to my kind of just purview of social media, she has still been in school for a lot of this. So like, how? I'm tired just, from being too hot during the day, as mentioned earlier. So how? I am in awe. So very interested to hear your thoughts on this if you've read this, especially in how this is in conversation with her other work, because I think that that is really interesting. So yeah, thanks for hanging out. Read something good, like, subscribe, comment, whatever you're feeling, and yeah, bye.